The relentless, rhythmic clack-clack-clack of laptop keys was the only sound anchoring Clara Higgins to reality in the suffocating silence of the master bedroom. It was nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. Outside, the autumn wind howled through the sprawling oaks of Austin, Texas, scratching like desperate fingernails against the double-paned glass. Inside, the harsh, artificial glare of her laptop screen burned against her bloodshot eyes, illuminating the stacks of third-grade spelling tests piled high on the desk. Her fingers were stiff, her lower back a dull, throbbing ache that had settled deep into her bones hours ago. She rubbed her temples, smelling the faint, bitter residue of cold, stale coffee from a mug she had emptied at midnight. Suddenly, a sharp, collective burst of laughter erupted from the downstairs living room, slicing through the thin drywall. The low, resonant baritone of her husband, Julian, mixed with the high-pitched, melodic cackle of her mother-in-law, Evelyn. They were sharing an intimate joke, warming themselves by the crackling brick fireplace. Clara paused, a grating pen hovering midair, leaving a bleeding red ink blot on a student's paper. Down there, the air undoubtedly smelled of expensive bourbon and the rich, buttery scent of the pecan pie Evelyn had baked earlier. Down there, they were a family. Up here, huddled under a single dim lamp to save on the electric bill, Clara felt less like a wife and more like a lingering spirit haunting the perimeter of their lives. Every month, without fail, Clara's phone would buzz with a banking notification. Half of her hard-earned paycheck from the Austin Public School District was automatically swept away to cover her exact 50% share of the mortgage. It was a transaction etched in legal stone, a silent bleeding of her financial veins to maintain the grand, 5-bedroom suburban house they called home. Yet, in the economy of the Higgins household, her sweat carried no weight. Only yesterday, as Clara stood in the kitchen scrubbing dried marinara sauce off the granite island, Julian had leaned against the stainless steel refrigerator, swirling a glass of iced water. "You know, Clara," he had murmured, his voice smooth, dripping with a calculated, casual indifference, "my tech consultancy firm just locked in another Fortune 500 client. The bonus alone could cover the mortgage for 6 months. It must be nice to have a little teaching job where the biggest crisis of your day is a spilled juice box. I just wish your contribution didn't feel like pocket change compared to the real heavy lifting." From the dining table, Evelyn had looked up from her knitting, the silver needles clicking in aggressive agreement. "Now, Julian, don't be harsh," the older woman had cooed, her voice heavily coated in a thick, suffocating southern drawl. "Clara does her best with what she has. Public service is charity work, really. We just have to accept that some people are born to build empires, and others are meant to tend to the domestic gardens." Clara had kept her eyes down, her knuckles turning white around the dish sponge, the soapy water turning cold against her skin. She swallowed the burning lump in her throat, forcing herself to believe the comforting lie she always told herself. "Hush. They don't mean it. Marriage is about sacrifice. I am supporting his dream." The ultimate test of her endurance arrived on Thanksgiving Thursday. The house was transformed into a theater of high society. Julian had invited his company's senior executives and the elusive CEO for a traditional holiday dinner. For 12 agonizing hours, Clara was the invisible engine driving the spectacle. The kitchen became a battleground of intense heat and overwhelming aromas. Her hands bore the stinging red marks of oven burns. Her apron was stained with turkey grease and cranberry reduction. Her feet were swollen, throbbing painfully inside her flats as she basted the 20-pound bird, polished the heavy silverware until her reflection blurred, and scrubbed every inch of the hardwood floors until they gleamed under the crystal chandelier. When the doorbell finally chimed, a chorus of loud, wealthy voices flooded the foyer. Clara stood in the hallway, wiping her sweaty brow, expecting to take her place beside her husband. Instead, Julian caught her by the elbow, his grip tight and unyielding, steering her gently but firmly back into the kitchen shadows. His breath smelled faintly of the expensive mints he kept in his tailored suit pocket. "Sweetheart," Julian whispered, his eyes scanning her stained apron and flush, exhausted face with open disapproval. "Look at you, you're exhausted. The tech talk tonight is going to be incredibly intense. Corporate restructuring, venture capital, high-level logistics. You'll just be bored out of your mind and stressed. Why don't you stay back here, keep the wine flowing, and eat comfortably at the kitchen counter? It's much more peaceful for you." Before she could speak, he slipped through the swinging double doors, joining the laughter. Clara stood frozen in the kitchen, surrounded by dirty pots and the carcass of the turkey she had roasted. She pressed her face against the small pane of glass in the kitchen door, watching the grand table through the narrow slit. Julian sat at the head, radiant and charming, pouring vintage Cabernet for his CEO. Then came the final, devastating blow. The CEO gestured toward the kitchen and asked a question Clara couldn't fully hear. Julian laughed, a light, dismissive wave of his hand. His voice floated clearly across the dining room, carrying through the cracked door. "Oh, that? Don't worry about her. That's just Clara. She's a local schoolteacher. We hire part-time to handle the domestic servants and holiday prepping. Keeps the place running, so I can focus on the firm." The words hung in the warm, festive air like toxic gas. Clara stepped back from the door, her breath hitching in her chest. She looked down at her trembling, calloused hands, then at the single plate of cold food she had set for herself on the kitchen counter. The silence of the kitchen pressed heavily against her ears, broken only by the distant, cheerful clinking of glasses celebrating a man who had just erased her existence to buy a moment of corporate vanity. The psychological aftershocks of Thanksgiving night did not arrive with a dramatic explosion, but rather as a slow, freezing mist that crept into the very plaster of the house. In the weeks that followed, Julian and Evelyn perfected the art of tactical silence and engineered isolation. When Clara entered a room, the lively chatter would instantly evaporate, leaving behind only the heavy, aromatic scent of Julian's expensive cologne and the sharp, rhythmic click-click-click of Evelyn's silver knitting needles. They did not yell. They simply looked through her, as if her 50% financial stake in the mortgage had bought her nothing more than the status of a transparent pane of glass. The systematic erasure of Clara's identity began in earnest on a chilly Tuesday afternoon. She returned from a grueling day at school, her throat raw from teaching phonics, and her fingers dusted with white chalk, looking forward to the quiet sanctuary of the small den. It was the only room in the sprawling 5-bedroom house she claimed as her own, a cozy space filled with the comforting, vanilla-like scent of her old university literature books and the worn fabric of her favorite reading armchair. But as she stepped across the threshold, her breath caught. The room smelled intensely of fresh paint, sweat, and cheap plastic packaging. 2 men in gray uniforms were hauling her mahogany bookshelves out into the hallway, stacking her beloved novels haphazardly on the floor like discarded kindling. In their place, a sleek, sterile glass desk had been installed, crowded with dual monitors, flashing neon green LED cables, and a massive streaming microphone. Julian stood by the window, aggressively waving his hands as he barked orders into a wireless earpiece. When he finally hung up, Clara pointed a trembling, chalk-stained finger at the monitors. "Julian, what is this? Where are my books? This was my only space." Before Julian could answer, the rustle of a stiff silk dress announced Evelyn's arrival. The older woman stepped into the room, her face masked in a terrifyingly pleasant, artificial smile. She gently patted Clara's arm, her touch feeling like ice through the fabric of Clara's blouse. "Now, Clara, let's be practical, sugar," Evelyn purred, her southern drawl thick and suffocating. Julian's tech consultancy firm is entering a crucial expansion phase. He needs a professional, high-tech backdrop for his international video conferences to maintain his corporate branding. A good wife accommodates her husband's decompression and workspace. Clara, you're just being overly sensitive and territorial about a few old textbooks. Julian smirked, turning his back to adjust a monitor, his silence a crushing confirmation of Clara's complete lack of authority. Clara stood frozen in the hallway, looking down at her chipped university degrees resting against the baseboard, the dust motes dancing mockingly in the sterile LED light. She felt a sickening wave of self-doubt wash over her. Am I being selfish? She questioned herself, the insidious poison of their gaslighting beginning to take root in her mind. The microaggressions quickly escalated from the physical environment to a total digital lockdown, designed to break her sense of autonomy. The definitive trap sprang on a rainy Thursday night. Clara had stayed late at the school to tutor a struggling student, her eyes burning from hours of reviewing lesson plans under harsh fluorescent lights. By the time she pulled her modest sedan into the dark, wet driveway of the suburban estate, the rain was coming down in sheets, drumming a cold, chaotic rhythm against the roof. Drenched and shivering, her arms wrapped tightly around a heavy cardboard box of graded assignments, Clara hurried up to the grand front porch. The air was thick with the earthy scent of wet soil and the sharp tang of ozone. She reached for the glowing digital keypad of the smart lock, her cold, stiff fingers typing in the familiar 4-digit code she had used for the past 3 years. Red flash. A harsh, electronic beep. Clara frowned, blinking away the rainwater dripping from her eyelashes. She carefully pressed the numbers again, pushing each button deliberately until it clicked. Red flash. Invalid code. Panic, cold and sharp, fluttered in her chest as the security panel began to emit a low, continuous warning tone. She knocked loudly against the heavy mahogany door, her knuckles bruising against the hard wood. After what felt like an eternity, the lock finally turned with a heavy, mechanical clunk. Julian stood in the warm, brightly lit foyer, wearing plush silk pajamas and holding a glass of amber bourbon. He looked entirely relaxed, exuding the calm superiority of a landlord dealing with an unwanted tenant. Julian, the lock is broken, Clara gasped, her teeth chattering as she stepped inside, leaving a trail of muddy water on the pristine hardwood floor. My code didn't work. I was stranded out there in the storm. Julian took a slow, deliberate sip of his drink, his eyes narrowing with a patronizing, pitying expression that cut deeper than any insult. The lock isn't broken. Clara, I updated the master security code this afternoon. I synchronized it with the PIN for my corporate accounts. Why wouldn't you text me the new code? Clara asked, her voice cracking with exhaustion. Julian let out a soft, highly dismissive sigh, shaking his head. Honestly, Clara, I forgot because your memory has been slipping so terribly lately. I figured it was safer this way. Remember last week when you left the kitchen stove burning for hours? Evelyn and I are deeply worried about your mental burnout. You're becoming a safety hazard to this house. From the shadows of the upstairs landing, Evelyn looked down, her face half hidden in the darkness, nodding in silent, grim approval. Clara stood alone in the dimly lit foyer, the blinking green light of the reset security panel reflecting in the puddles at her feet. The house felt less like a home and more like a psychological cage, its walls slowly closing in, forcing her to accept the terrifying narrative that she was losing her mind, completely unaware of the darker rot festering just beneath the surface. The breakdown of a home's structural integrity rarely announces itself with a thunderous roar. It begins with the quiet, sickening snap of a single load-bearing pillar. For Clara, that snap occurred in the heavy, shadow-drenched quiet of a Saturday morning, desperate for a tangible link to a time when she was loved, she stepped into the master bedroom, while Julian and Evelyn were out. The air in the room was thick with the scent of Julian's expensive musk-heavy cologne, a scent that now made her stomach churn. She opened the deep mahogany closet, kneeling before her private wall safe. Her fingers dry and trembling from a long week of chalk dust and anxiety, dialed the combination. The heavy steel door clicked open. She reached into the very back, her skin seeking the familiar, cool texture of the dark blue velvet box that held her mother's antique pearl necklace. It was her most sacred heirloom, a flawless strand left to her, with a dying wish. Let this pass to your own daughter, Clara. But as her hand lifted the box, a cold shock ran down her spine. The weight was entirely wrong. It felt hollow, light as a dried leaf. She pressed the golden clasp, and the lid sprang back. The plush cream velvet interior was completely empty. The necklace was gone. A suffocating panic seized her throat. The physical absence of the pearls felt like a brutal theft of her mother's very memory. The only people alive who possessed the code to that safe were herself and Julian. The absolute certainty of who had done this hit her like a physical blow, leaving her gasping for air in the silent, hostile room. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the empty box, a blinding, ferocious heat rising in her chest to fight off the icy dread. The confrontation that followed an hour later was not a discussion. It was a coordinated psychological execution. Julian and Evelyn returned, the front door shutting with a heavy, definitive thud. When Clara marched into the kitchen, slamming the empty velvet box onto the immaculate quartz island, the sharp crack echoed through the open-plan house. Julian didn't even flinch. He casually poured himself a glass of orange juice, the bright citrus scent filling the tense air. When Clara demanded to know where the necklace was, Julian exchanged a swift, knowing look with his mother. Then he turned to Clara, his face shifting into a perfectly practiced mask of profound, patronizing pity. "Clara, look at yourself right now," Julian said, lowering his voice into a soothing, deeply insulting register. "You are hyperventilating over a piece of jewelry you probably misplaced weeks ago. The stress of your little teaching job, the constant curriculum changes, it's clearly causing a cognitive burnout. Your memory is fracturing, sweetheart." Evelyn stepped closer, the soft rustle of her silk blouse sounding like a snake sliding through dry grass. She reached out, her manicured hand cold and heavy as she pressed a damp dishcloth against Clara's forehead. "Julian is right, darling. Last month you swore you lost your grandmother's silver thimble, and we found it in the pantry. You're becoming increasingly paranoid, projecting your internal confusion onto us. If this erratic behavior continues, we will have no choice but to call Dr. Adler for an involuntary psychiatric evaluation. We cannot have an unstable person disrupting the peace of this home." The audacity of their gaslighting was suffocating. They were actively trying to rewrite her reality, weaponizing her exhaustion to paint her as a madwoman. For a second, the ground beneath Clara's feet felt entirely unstable. But the final shattering of her denial happened the very next morning by sheer, poetic accident. As Evelyn hurried out the door for church, a small slip of paper fluttered out of her trench coat pocket, landing silently on the welcome mat. Clara picked it up. The texture was cheap, coarse paper, smelling faintly of grease and industrial cleaner. It was a computerized pawnshop receipt from a shady downtown establishment. The item described in cold, digital print, one antique pearl necklace. The payout, a mere fraction of its worth. Later that afternoon, driven by a new, freezing clarity, Clara waited until the house was empty. She bypassed the living spaces and moved directly to Julian's desk. Her fingers flew across his laptop, accessing their joint savings account. The numbers on the screen burned into her eyes. The balance was $0, an amount of $80,000, their entire shared future, much of it funded by her extra tutoring hours, had been systematically liquidated over the past 3 months. A secondary digital search revealed the destination: a wire transfer to a luxury dealership for a new BMW under Julian's sole name, and thousands spent on high-end jewelry and hotel reservations for a younger female consultant at his firm. Clara stood perfectly still in the sterile glow of the monitors. The suffocating grief that had weighed her down for months evaporated, replaced instantly by a crystalline, absolute resolve. The naive, accommodating wife who believed in silent sacrifice died in that room. The analytical educator, the master organizer of chaos, awoke. She did not weep. She did not scream. She realized that fighting them with tears was a tactical disaster. They would use her emotions as documented proof of her instability. She folded the pawnshop receipt, sliding it into her pocket like a piece of cold steel. You cannot reform a parasite with love, she thought, her breath steady, and even for the first time in years. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in a decade. "Sarah," Clara said, her voice devoid of any frailty, ringing with a chilling finality. "It's Clara. I need a lawyer, and I need you to help me dismantle a kingdom." The transformation did not begin with a loud declaration of war, but with the cold, calculated precision of a woman redesigning the chaotic interior of her own life. Sitting in the sleek, high-rise office of Sarah Jenkins, the air smelling of polished leather, expensive espresso, and heavy legal volumes, Clara felt the final remnants of her old, submissive self dissolve. Sarah, looking sharp in a tailored navy blazer, slid a fresh pen across the glass desk. The transition from victim to strategist required immediate, unsentimental action. The first strike was a quiet, digital decoupling of their financial veins. The very next morning, Clara walked into a boutique bank 3 districts away from her usual branch. The lobby smelled faintly of clean linen and crisp paper. With a steady hand, she opened a private checking account under her sole name. She immediately marched to the school district's administrative office, filled out a direct deposit form, and watched the clerk click the confirmation button. For the first time in years, her hard-earned teaching salary was routed entirely away from the joint account. The psychological shift manifested instantly at home. When the monthly bills arrived, Clara quietly paid exactly her half of the essential utilities, leaving Julian's platinum credit card statements and Evelyn's high-end organic grocery receipts completely untouched on the counter. Within 10 days, the financial friction became palpable. She could hear Julian in the hallway, his voice tight and strained as he argued with a credit card customer service representative, the frantic tapping of his leather loafers against the floorboards echoing his rising panic. Simultaneously, Sarah uncovered a critical vulnerability in the original deed of the house. Julian and his mother had assumed the property was a locked asset, but the paperwork revealed it was held under a joint tenancy with right of survivorship. Seizing the initiative, Clara signed the documents for a severance of joint tenancy, effectively converting the ownership into a tenancy in common. The legal clerk's heavy steel stamp came down on the paper with a definitive, ringing thud that vibrated through Clara's fingertips. Her 50% equity was now an impenetrable fortress, legally frozen and entirely protected. Julian could no longer use the house as leverage for a commercial loan without her explicit, notarized consent. To secure the perimeter of her defense, Clara turned her classroom management skills into espionage tactics. While Julian and Evelyn were out celebrating a minor corporate promotion downtown, Clara executed her surveillance plan. The house was quiet, filled only with the hum of the central air conditioning. Moving with silent efficiency, she unboxed 4 military-grade microcameras Sarah had provided. She stood on a kitchen chair, splicing a lens no larger than a pinhead into the electrical wiring of the smoke detector. She hid another inside the lush silk petals of a faux hydrangea arrangement on the mantelpiece. By the time she finished, the living room and kitchen were completely wired, capturing every angle in high-definition infrared clarity. The final phase of her reclamation was physical and intellectual. Clara walked into a high-end salon downtown, the air rich with the scent of lavender oil and expensive hair products. She watched the stylist silver shears snip away inches of her long, unkempt hair, letting the dead weight fall to the floor. She emerged with a sharp, asymmetrical bob that framed her face with clean, commanding lines. She replaced her faded cardigans with structured tweed blazers and tailored trousers that clicked with authority whenever she moved. Every evening, instead of retreating to the damp isolation of her thoughts, Clara logged onto her laptop to attend her online master's courses in educational leadership. She immersed herself in the dense, complex texts of organizational management, her mind sharpening with every passing hour. When she walked through the house, she no longer looked at the floor. She looked Julian and Evelyn directly in the eyes, her voice cool and perfectly level, completely devoid of the old emotional frailty. She stopped answering their passive-aggressive demands, treating their presence with the same detached indifference they had used to make her feel invisible. She had effectively turned them into ghosts in a house she was preparing to reclaim. The financial noose around Julian's neck began to tighten with the suffocating intensity of a rising tide. With Clara's paychecks diverted and the joint accounts bone dry, the aesthetic of their high-status life started to fray at the edges like a cheap, sun-bleached curtain. The house, once a sanctuary of polished convenience, became a pressure cooker of hidden resentment. Julian spent his nights pacing the upstairs hallway, his footsteps sounding like erratic drum beats against the hardwood, while the scent of his anxiety, a sharp, acidic mix of sweat and desperate tobacco, seemed to seep through the floorboards. Drowning in the mounting debt of his luxury car lease and the expensive hidden gifts he continued to shower upon his mistress to maintain his crumbling facade, Julian's arrogance finally blinded him to the trap beneath his feet. He believed he was the master strategist, the tech visionary, who could manipulate the system. Desperation, however, is the enemy of wisdom. He decided to execute the ultimate betrayal. He would leverage the house itself. One humid Tuesday, while Clara was away at a school district meeting, Julian initiated an application for a $100,000 home equity line of credit, HELOC. To bypass the requirement of Clara's physical presence, he utilized a forged power of attorney, POA document he had procured through an underground connection. A document so intricately crafted it would fool any cursory glance. He sat at the sterile glass desk, the blue light of the monitors casting a sickly, alien pallor across his features, his fingers dancing across the keys with a frantic, rhythmic intensity as he uploaded the fraudulent papers to the bank's portal. Deep in her office, Sarah Jenkins sat before a dual-monitor setup that hummed with the quiet power of a legal command center. Her credit monitoring software pinged, a sharp, digital notification that cut through the silence like a gunshot. The HELOC application appeared on her screen in bold, undeniable detail. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she traced the digital trail of the forged POA. Clara, sitting in the passenger seat of her sedan while waiting for a red light, checked her phone and saw the notification. Her heart gave a singular, powerful thump against her ribs, but her hands remained steady on the steering wheel. She had already mapped this trajectory with Sarah. They could have blocked it instantly. They could have sent a cease and desist that would have sent Julian scrambling for cover. Let him sign it, Clara. Sarah's voice echoed in her memory, calm and dangerous. Let the bank process the paperwork. Let him believe he has successfully crossed the finish line. The moment that loan hits the final underwriting stage, the moment he commits to the financial obligation based on a forgery, this ceases to be a domestic marital dispute. It becomes a definitive, high-level federal financial crime. We want the paper trail to be absolute. Clara tucked her phone away, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. She felt a strange, cold peace, a complete detachment from the man who had once been her world. A week later, the mail arrived. Julian was hovering in the foyer when the postman pushed a heavy, official-looking envelope through the brass slot. He snatched it up, his breath hitching, his fingers trembling with a mix of terror and avarice as he tore it open. Inside lay the conditional approval letter from the bank, the gold-embossed seal shimmering under the hallway light. Julian let out a ragged, triumphant sound, a mix between a laugh and a sob. He leaned against the wall, sliding down until he hit the floor, his face flushed with the terrifying relief of a drowning man who thinks he has finally grabbed a lifeline. He looked up, catching his mother's eye as she emerged from the kitchen. Evelyn leaned down, pressing a hand to his shoulder, her face radiating a dark, greedy pride. They stood there, caught in the intoxicating, synthetic glow of their own perceived victory, entirely unaware that the letter in Julian's hand was not a lifeline, but the final, structural failure of his existence. They were celebrating the very evidence that would ensure his total, permanent erasure. In the shadows of the upstairs landing, Clara watched them, her posture perfectly erect, her face a mask of serene, untouchable granite. The trap was set, the bait was taken. The countdown to their public undoing had officially begun. The cold, crisp air of a Texas winter night pressed heavily against the grand brick facade of the Higgins estate, but inside, the house was a roaring furnace of opulent warmth and corporate pretense. The scent of roasted prime rib, rosemary-infused butter, and expensive Cabernet Sauvignon filled the open-plan first floor, masking the underlying tension that had simmered for months. It was the night of Julian's grand Christmas cocktail party. The high-ceilinged living room buzzed with the smooth, rhythmic chatter of the company's tech executives, senior VPs, and the elusive CEO himself. Laughter chimed like expensive crystal, and the air felt thick with the heavy perfume of wealthy spouses and the sharp, distinct aroma of premium cigars drifting from the heated patio. Julian stood near the center of the room, the absolute picture of a thriving tech visionary. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his hair meticulously styled, a sparkling glass of champagne held loosely in his hand. He was in his element, doting on the executives and soaking in their praise. Earlier that evening, he had pulled Clara into the kitchen, his grip tight and his voice an aggressive, hissed whisper. "Stay back here, Clara. My CEO is here, and the talk tonight is strictly high-level venture capital. You'll only embarrass me with your schoolteacher talk. Keep the catering trays full, and don't come out." He had left her surrounded by dirty stainless steel pans and the heat of the roaring ovens. But Julian had severely underestimated the woman who had spent the last 4 weeks meticulously mapping out the structural demolition of his ego, exactly halfway through the gala. Just as the CEO was raising a glass to toast Julian's upcoming promotion, a sudden, heavy silence rippled through the staircase landing. The rhythmic clinking of glasses froze. Every eye in the grand room turned upward. Clara was descending the sweeping staircase. She did not shuffle. She walked with the slow, commanding grace of an absolute ruler. Her sharp, asymmetrical bob caught the warm light of the crystal chandelier, framing a face carved from untouchable, serene granite. She was breathtaking, draped in a backless, tailored evening gown of midnight black that exuded pure, unyielding authority. The faded cardigans and chalk dust were entirely gone. Her heels clicked against the pristine hardwood stairs with a slow, deliberate thud-thud-thud that sounded like a funeral march for Julian's career. Julian's face turned a violent, sickly shade of crimson. He rushed toward the base of the stairs, a strained, sweaty smile plastered across his face as he tried to intercept her. "Clara, sweetheart, you're clearly exhausted," Julian stammered, his voice cracking slightly as he reached out to forcefully grab her elbow. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize. My wife has been suffering from severe mental burnout and a fractured memory lately. Let me escort her back to rest." Clara didn't even flinch. She stepped back smoothly, breaking his physical contact with total, ice-cold detachment. She ignored him entirely, her gaze locked onto the crowded room. She walked gracefully past the stunned CEO and approached the massive 85-inch smart TV mounted above the fireplace, the screen Julian had meticulously set up to project his company's new quarterly strategy presentation. "Good evening, everyone." Clara's voice rang out, perfectly level, clear, and dripping with a chilling finality that silenced the room completely. "Before Julian begins his presentation on growth and integrity, I believe you all deserve to see the true blueprint of his latest venture." With a singular, calm tap of her thumb on her phone screen, she activated the cell uplink. The TV screen blinked twice, clearing the corporate logo, and instantly boomed to life. The high-definition infrared video and crystal-clear audio filled the vaulted room. On the screen, in vivid monochrome clarity, Julian's voice blared through the house's integrated surround sound speakers. "Once the bank clears the $100,000 helic tomorrow, the debt is wiped clean. The mistress gets her apartment, and Clara gets a one-way ticket to a locked ward." The screen cut sharply to footage of Julian and his younger co-worker entangled on the very velvet sofa the vice president was currently sitting on. Then came Evelyn's voice, cold and calculating. "Just keep telling the neighbors she's losing her mind. Julian, the fake medical report from Adler is airtight. Once she's locked away, the house is ours." The collective gasp from the executives was a sharp, physical wave of air. Julian's parents stood frozen in the corner, their faces turning a pale, ashen gray as their golden child's empire evaporated in real time. The CEO's glass shattered against the hearth, red wine pooling on the rug like fresh blood. Julian was hyperventilating, his eyes rolling back in sheer unadulterated panic as he lunged toward the TV screen, screaming incoherently. Before he could touch the wires, the heavy mahogany front door swung open with an authoritative crash. The freezing winter wind rushed through the foyer, carrying flurries of snow that melted instantly on the heated floors. Standing framed in the threshold was Sarah Jenkins, her eyes sharp as a hawk, flanked by 3 armed Austin police officers. The lead officer stepped purposefully onto the Persian rug, the heavy steel handcuffs unclipping from his utility belt with a sharp, metallic clink that sounded like a gavel striking a judge's bench. He grabbed Julian by the shoulder, forcefully spinning the trembling tech consultant around and slamming his chest against the cold glass of the display cabinet. "Julian Higgins, you are under arrest for felony bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny," the officer stated, his flat, uncompromising baritone filling the stunned silence of the room. Julian thrashed weakly, his perfectly styled hair, now a tangled, sweaty mess across his forehead. He frantically twisted his neck, his wild, weeping eyes locked onto his CEO. "Sir, please, this is a medical episode. My wife is insane," he screamed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, hysterical whine. The CEO didn't look him in the eye. He turned to his senior VP, his face twisted in utter disgust, and barked, "Fire him. Terminate his contract immediately. Scrub his name from every corporate file before the press gets hold of this." He then turned, gesturing to the other executives, and the entire crowd began to flee the house in chaotic, shameful silence, leaving Julian to be dragged down the hallway, his expensive leather shoes scraping pathetically against the very floors Clara had contributed her life's blood to buy. The chaotic din of the flashing sirens and the rumbling police cruisers gradually faded into the crisp, biting winter night, leaving the grand suburban estate trapped in a profound, heavy silence. The immediate threat was permanently neutralized, but the thick, suffocating air of betrayal still clung to the vaulted ceilings of the dining room. Clara turned away from the glass door and walked slowly back into the main living area. There, crumpled on the expensive Persian rug, was Evelyn. The once domineering Southern matriarch was completely undone, a disheveled mess of stiff silk, smeared makeup, and ruined vanity. She threw herself forward, her manicured fingers clawing desperately at the hem of Clara's tailored trousers, her shoulders shaking with loud, hysterical sobs. "Clara, please, you have to listen to me, sugar." Evelyn wailed, her eyes wild with terror as tears cut tracks through the heavy foundation on her face. "Julian was under so much pressure from the firm. He manipulated me, too. He convinced me that your memory was failing, that we were just protecting the estate. I never wanted to hurt you, darling. I never wanted to send you to that awful place. Please, you're a good Christian woman. You have to forgive us." Clara stood perfectly still, looking down at the top of her mother-in-law's trembling head. She waited in the silence for the familiar, soft ache of her old, empathetic self to rise, the urge to kneel, to comfort, to offer a blanket of easy forgiveness. But inside her chest, the well of blind compliance had run completely dry. There was no rage, no heat, no bitter urge to scream. There was only a vast, hollow space filled with absolute, freezing clarity. Slowly, deliberately, Clara reached down. Her fingers, strong and unyielding, peeled Evelyn's clutching hands off her fabric one by one. She took a measured step backward, breaking the physical connection, and leaving the older woman sprawled helplessly on the floor. "Julian didn't manipulate you into stealing, Evelyn," Clara said, her voice dropping into a flat, icy baritone that cut through the weeping. "He didn't force your hand to sign those fraudulent commitment papers, and he certainly didn't force you to take my mother's heirloom pearl necklace to a grimy downtown pawnshop to fund his cowardice." Clara pulled a crisp, folded piece of paper from the inner breast pocket of her structure blazer and let it flutter down, landing right in front of Evelyn's trembling knees. It was the pawnshop receipt. Evelyn's breath hitched, the excuses dying instantly in her throat as the cold, physical evidence of her greed stared back at her. "You believed my love for this family was an infinite, cheap resource you could exploit without consequence," Clara continued, looking at the dried red wine stains spreading like fresh blood across the white linen tablecloth. "You thought you could strip away my dignity, treat me like a ghost, and still inherit the kingdom. But a home requires a foundation of fundamental respect. Without it, love is just a vulnerability for parasites. I am not your invisible servant anymore. I am the woman reclaiming her life." Clara pulled back the cuff of her blazer and checked her watch. It was exactly 9 p.m. "You have exactly 60 minutes, she commanded, her tone ringing with absolute, irrevocable authority. 1 hour to go upstairs, pack whatever personal belongings fit into the trunk of your car, and walk out of my front door. Leave the house keys on the kitchen counter. If you are still standing inside these walls at 10 p.m., I will have the officers return, and I will personally press grand larceny charges for the theft of my mother's pearls. The choice is yours." Evelyn scrambled to her feet, her face twisted in pure terror, as she realized the absolute seriousness in Clara's eyes. Within minutes, the house echoed with the frantic, chaotic sounds of heavy drawers being yanked open upstairs and suitcases being hastily zipped shut. 50 minutes later, the heavy mahogany front door clicked open and shut. From the bay window, Clara watched Evelyn drag 2 canvas bags through the snow, her tail lights bleeding red into the dark Texas night before vanishing completely. A sudden, Soft hum broke the silence as the professional locksmith Clara had prearranged stepped into the foyer. Clara stood quietly, listening to the rhythmic, mechanical clink-clink-clink of his tools as he systematically stripped the old brass cylinders from the doors. The physical act of replacing the tumblers felt deeply symbolic. With every turn of the screwdriver, she was permanently sealing the structural breaches of her past, locking out the tactical silence and the manipulation that had starved her soul for years. She paid the man in cash, thanked him, and turned the new heavy deadbolt with a solid, satisfying thud. For the first time in her entire marriage, Clara was truly alone inside her own home. She poured a single glass of rich Cabernet Sauvignon, the deep red liquid catching the amber glow of the fading fireplace embers. She walked over to the plush reading armchair, now returned to its rightful place, and sat down, letting the soothing warmth of the room soak into her skin. The oppressive, suffocating weight was gone, swept away by the freezing winter wind outside. The betrayal of her husband still carried a dull, lingering ache, but it was entirely eclipsed by a magnificent, soaring sense of absolute freedom. She did not need to hide. She did not need to shrink. Her mind was sharp, her boundaries ironclad, and her spirit entirely victorious. Clara raised her crystal glass in a silent, solitary toast to the quiet night. She opened her fresh lesson planner on her lap. On the very first page, beneath the soft glow of her reading lamp, she uncapped her pen and wrote in clean, commanding strokes. "A home built on deception cannot stand. I tore down the rot, and upon the bedrock of my own strength, I am finally free. All shadows must fade before the truth, and every pain is simply the start of a beautiful rebirth. Always remember, the right to write a new chapter of your life is forever in your hands." Please like, share, and subscribe if this story resonated with you. Hope to see you on the next page.